Recently I did a Dirac live calibration for a customer's hi-fi system, and we got chatting because really it's like chatting to another like-minded audio enthusiast. And I found really the customer's journey to where he was with his hi-fi system, I suppose his journey to me and to Dirac Live and DSP, really quite interesting because I could relate to a lot of it. And I thought there's a good chance that you could relate to a lot of it as well. So I thought maybe a case study of this Audiophile's hi-fi system could be very interesting, because I know a lot of audiophiles are really nosy and they find it interesting looking at and finding out about what other audiophiles are doing with their hi-fi systems. And while that bit is really interesting, of course it is, the journey, that audiophile's journey, is also very interesting too. Jason is the customer's name, and he is what I would say is a regular guy, and I don't want to sound demeaning in any way, but by that I mean he is married with 2 children. He's an intelligent guy with a very nice job. I don't think he was uber rich, not that I could tell anyway. So that means he is balancing his hi-fi system and everything he wants to do with that, with his family, with his life, and all the other constraints of life that we can all relate to. And he is very lucky to have a dedicated space in his home for his hi-fi system and music listening. But still, it's a space he is having to make work, not a space designed for audio reproduction. I'm sure you can all relate to that challenge, and it's the making it work aspect that I think is probably the most interesting part of this case study, because that is the part that I think brought Jason to me and brought Jason to Dirac Live and to DSP. And I am very proud of the calibration that I did on Jason's hi-fi system, because it really lifted and really elevated the performance of that hi-fi system to something that he would never have been able to achieve without it. And that sounds like a big plug for me and a big advert for me and my Dirac Live calibration service. And you know what, it may well be, but I'm totally fine with it, because everything that I'm going to say in this video is 100% accurate and true. And I want to talk you through what I did actually as part of the Dirac Live calibration, but let's finish there. Why don't we start at the very beginning? I actually want to start with coffee. Coffee is a lot like hi-fi. You might start off drinking jar-bought instant coffee, which is okay, right? It's very drinkable and it does its job. It gives you a bit of a lift. But once you've visited maybe a Starbucks or a Costa and had that barista coffee experience with that rich creamy flavour and that frothy milk, it's very hard to go back to jar-bought stuff. I'm sure you will agree. And maybe, canned beer versus draft beer could be another comparison. And for me, this is the epitome of the hi-fi journey. You maybe have some kind of, audio playback system that is doing its job. It's playing music and you're enjoying listening to that music. But one day you have the experience. You have the experience of a hi-fi system that is set up well and it sounds mega. And it just lights that fire in your belly. And it's then very difficult to go back to just listening to a system that's just doing its job. You want that, mega experience all the time. And with coffee, how do you get the barista quality at home? Well, you can go about it many different ways. I personally went this way with a mocha pot, a milk frother, and a nice bag of beans. And I was totally satisfied with the coffee from this setup until I did this calibration, until Jason gave me a coffee that was made on a top-level domestic machine. But it wasn't really the machine, it was the fact that this coffee was made with real care and attention to the brew time, the grind of the coffee, even the milk and the temperature of everything going through it. And the taste and the experience of that coffee was really quite an interesting experience, because it showed me, opened my eyes to what is possible from coffee when it's made by someone who really knows what they are doing. And bringing this all back to hi-fi for a second, again, this is the epitome of Jason's hi-fi journey, because he'd had what I think are some very nice hi-fi systems. He said he'd had a Hegel amplifier that he was using as a streamer and a DAC, and obviously an amplifier playing into some Amphium speakers, and that sounds like a very nice hi-fi setup to me. He said he'd had KEF R3 speakers and other bits and pieces, but he said he was trying to find a sound synergy, a sound synergy or system synergy sweet spot. And he said he just didn't have the money to just keep buying and trying lots of different components. What Jason did, I think, is smart. He initially spoke to GRK Acoustics, who recommended some room treatments to him, which I think looked discreet and they blended in with his room's decor. And I think his room, with lots of hard surfaces, exposed wood floors, a few cushions and a rug, just wouldn't cut it. Well placed professional room treatments, you could really hear in the room that this was helping to balance the room's natural liveliness. But what about system components? Jason said he started following the advice of Christian Punter, who runs the HiFi Advice website. I'm sure some of you have likely been on there before. And Jason trusted the advice from this website and put together the basics of his system, which includes Wilson Benesch Precision P1 speakers, an Audio GD DAC and preamplifier, a Mano Ultra music streamer, and new Prime amplification. And of course there are other bits as well that forms the basis of this very nice hi-fi system. Jason also listens to the Hi-Fi podcast, which is PS Audio's Darren Myers and Duncan, somebody who also works in the trade. And he said he picked up lots of little and sometimes large tips from this podcast, such as the advice of installing 2-rel T7i subwoofers, such as installing isolation from ISO Acoustics under his speakers and the subwoofers. And he also picked up advice on reducing the overall noise in his system, and he is using several linear power supplies rather than switching ones, and he is connecting his Rune Core server to his music server via a fibre link rather than, say, a Cat 6 or 7 or similar. And Jason is also using Townsend super tweeters, and this is only the second system that I've ever listened to that used super tweeters. And when I asked him about it, he said, this made me laugh, is that he felt as he was filling in the bass with subwoofers, he should also be filling in the treble with super tweeters. And that's quite an interesting way to look at it, but it's also quite hard to argue with that logic. So I think you can see Jason has put together a very nice hi-fi system, and he has paid lots of attentions to lots of details. And obviously I got to listen to the hi-fi system before I did the Dirac Live calibration, and I think my first thought about it was it sounded delicate. It had a real graceful ease about its presentation. That is partly what he liked about it, a very musical sounding overall system presentation. I noticed it had a very low noise floor, which was very impressive, and overall, yeah, it sounded very nice and very enjoyable. I want to bring you back to coffee. You might be looking at this system and thinking you would do it differently. Maybe pick a different speaker or a different coffee bean. You might grind that bean a little finer or maybe use a different DAC. And this is how we make it work for us, isn't it? We choose the parts or the components and put them together to try and create the sound that we really like. But you can only ever really take it so far, either because of financial constraints, maybe room constraints, or loads of other reasons. And that is why I feel Jason came to me and found his way to Dirac Live and DSP. And on my advice, Jason added a mini DSP SHD studio to the system so he could connect digital in and digital out and use it purely for Dirac Live and DSP processing. So all that work was happening in the digital domain before his DAC, or before any digital to analog conversion, which is the perfect place for it. And this is really where I come into this story, or into this case study, because when I was listening to the system before the calibration, as I mentioned, I was very impressed with it in a lot of ways, but I could definitely hear where I felt I could make some very big improvements to how the system was set up and just how everything was organized and balanced sound wise within the room. Being honest, I made a noticeable improvement to the upper mid-range and treble. I've made the system sound more neutral overall, and I was able to better integrate the speakers tweeter with the super tweeter, but that's not really where I made the biggest improvements. The first big improvement I made to this system was getting more out of the subwoofers, and I don't necessarily mean more bass out of them. Actually, it could be perceived as less bass, but what I mean is more bass frequency, more of the bass frequency range. And obviously Jason had set the subwoofers up by ear, and he'd done the best that he could. But looking at how he'd set them up, they wasn't really doing much. All they was really doing was adding a little bit of bass at the very deepest of frequencies. And that's really interesting because I feel like he's probably followed what is given out as the common best advice. And I think audiophiles just assume that the speakers in their room are going to measure or perform exactly how it says on the spec sheet. Maybe a flat frequency response down to the exact point where those speakers roll off. And then all you need to do is set the crossover on the subwoofer to where the speakers roll off, and then they should match up pretty much perfectly if you get the level right. And while that theory makes a lot of sense, I must have measured at least 50 different speakers and subwoofers in 50 different rooms, and they never look or they never measure anything like that kind of theoretical perfect situation. And what was happening in Jason's room is that he was getting leaner bass from the speakers through a certain key and critical range than would be ideal. And that is because of SBIR, speaker boundary interaction. And that is happening in every room. Whenever you put speakers in a room, you're going to get SBIR. And that can cause bass cancellation at the listening position, bass that you just don't hear, or just bass that you don't hear enough of. Because I was able to measure and see all of this, my first thought was, well, let's use the subwoofers. Let's increase or up the crossover frequency on the subwoofers to start filling in or start supporting the speakers better in the upper bass critical region. And I hope some of this is really hitting home, because this will be the situation, I think, with a lot of different audiophiles, a lot of different rooms, and a lot of different speaker subwoofer situations. And what really stood out to me about this calibration, and it's the same with all of them, is that the frequency response of the subwoofer was so different to the frequency response of the speaker, even though they was only maybe a foot or two apart, that it would have been impossible really to perfectly integrate the two together, because the frequency responses are so different. Back to what I said about that theoretical ideal, we are so far away from that, it's going to be damn near impossible to perfectly integrate the speakers and the subwoofers together. So what I did first was try and improve the situation that we had before any Dirac calibration was to take place. So the first thing I did was, increase the crossover on the subwoofers, getting the subwoofers doing more of the bass, getting them supporting the speakers more. The reason I could do this is because I had full trust and confidence that the rail subwoofers would be fast enough to deliver bass as fast as the speakers, or as fast as we need it to be. I then increased the volume on the subwoofers a little bit, but I increased the volume on the subwoofer on the left more than the right. That was to offset some of the obvious proximity effect of the listening position being that bit closer to the right subwoofer than the left subwoofer. I then spent hours dialing in the Dirac Live calibration curve, managing the bass, managing the overall speaker's sound, managing the speaker and subwoofer integration for it to be pretty much exactly how I wanted it, sounding totally integrated. And the system now didn't sound like you was listening to speakers and subwoofers, it sounded like you was listening to much larger speakers. And the bass was kicking when it needed to be, but it was fast, tight, precise, agile, and most importantly, totally transparent. And once I got the whole calibration totally dialed in, it was really interesting, because then you wasn't listening to a hi-fi system anymore, you was genuinely just listening to music, and you was able to pick out details and track all the music production and everything from the treble right down into the deepest of bass. It definitely was the subwoofers and the subwoofer integration that brought out the sound of what this system is capable of, which is why a lot of audiophiles and people will promote adding subwoofers to speakers, because what you can achieve with them when things are done well is really quite surprising and extremely impressive. And what's most critical, I think, is the bass between, say, 50 Hz and 500 Hz. But really interesting, also bass between 50 and 30 Hz really makes a significant difference. And it's not really the subwoofers that's making this difference, it's the bass that they are creating that makes the difference to how we perceive the whole sound of the whole system. But what was interesting is, with a mini DSP unit, with a remote control, you can, at the press of a button, push the calibration on and off. And the hi-fi system that we've been listening to just hours before, that was sounding really impressive, when we turned the calibration off to go back to that, the whole sound just collapsed and it just sounded hollow, disjointed, completely separated. So the calibration back on, everything knitted itself back together. And again, it was like you was listening to much larger speakers rather than small speakers and subwoofers. If you look at the feedback that Jason sent me after, he is as happy as a pig in with his hi-fi system. He was happy before, but he knew there was more to come. And now I think he really appreciates just what you can do with something like Dirac Live. What an amazingly powerful tool that is. But like I say to everybody, it's just a tool. It's not a magic wand. So you need to be able to use the tool and understand really what's happening in a room, what's happening with a system, and really understand what its strengths and its weaknesses are to try and offset that. But hopefully you can take away from this that, and the key message I wanted to really put out is that the challenge that we all have is we're trying to make hi-fi work in domestic spaces that are not designed for audio reproduction. And 9 times out of 10, people are trying to make their hi-fi systems work, in another space, in a space that's been shared with family, in a living space where we don't have full freedom to put, acoustic treatments everywhere we want. So we are really trying to make it work. That is what the audiophile's job. It's the manufacturer's job to make the speakers, to make the amplifiers, to make the cables, to make the streamers. But it's the audiophile's job to make it work. And I feel like there's a bit of a divide actually between, manufacturers making it, dealers maybe selling it, and then the audiophile being left on their own to make it work at home. Definitely don't be put off by Dirac Live, because if you've had a bad experience of DSP, it's probably because it's either bad DSP or it's been used poorly. Dirac Live is very powerful, very, very good DSP, but you just need to know how to use it to extract what it can do to give you exactly the sound that you want. And I think the most important thing is I was able to achieve this massive improvement in sound quality from Jason's system without changing anything. I didn't move any speakers, I didn't move any subwoofers. I just maximized what he had by making it work in his room. So I hope this is an interesting video, something definitely a little bit different from me, a Pursuit of Perfect system, but I thought it might be interesting and I hope you have enjoyed it. If you have, smash the thumbs up button. If you haven't, maybe smash the thumbs down button twice as well. Maybe go and visit a Pursuit of Perfect system website, Dirac Live calibration website. Subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.